I suppose the biggest thing for me is there are so many conflicting rules and regulations. If you look on YouTube, for instance, there's so many very good photographers actually, but the information that they can give out can be very often misleading, or they've got their way of doing it and that seems to be the only way, and that really isn't the case at all. Any digital SLR camera, any camera, your iPhone, absolutely anything. In actual fact, when you first start out with street photography, it can be a little bit intimidating throwing one of these in people's faces. So more often than not, a good way of actually starting out is to use your iPhone. And even if you aim at people, just smile at the back of the camera and they'll just assume that you're taking a selfie and won't even realise most of the time that you've even taken a picture. The rule is simply this: there isn't a right and a wrong lens for street photography. So there's advantages with one lens over another lens, but pretty much any lens will do. And if you watch lots of videos on YouTube, you will find that certain people will recommend, let's say for instance, a 50mm prime lens, shoot wide open, so you playing around with that shallow depth of field all the time. Well, that's brilliant, and that does work really well. And you know, even I'm happy to suggest doing that as well. But of course then you miss out on lots of wide shots. So sometimes a 10 or a 12mm wide angle lens will capture more of the event, will tell more of the story, will include more people, and of course if you include more people, the picture will be busier, which is more than likely to pull people back to your image time and time again, just to see really what's going on in the image. So there isn't a right and wrong lens and a right and wrong camera. There just isn't. There's advantages over one, disadvantages over another. It's as simple as that. There's a lot of misinformation with regards to which camera settings to use and which cameras not to use when it comes to street photography. So let me just kind of quash a few of those myths right now. Well, first and foremost, when you first start off, it doesn't really matter. Don't get too et up and don't get too carried away with which setting to use, which setting not to use. Simply set your camera to P or shoot in a fully automatic mode. That's my recommendation to you. But of course, if you want to take it one stage further, then think about your shutter speed priority and think about your aperture priority. Now, more often than not, when I'm shooting street photography, I'm in shutter speed priority. Make sure, by the way, if you shoot in shutter speed priority or aperture priority, make sure you set your ISO to auto if your camera will allow it. So let me just explain then. When I'm walking around, let's say for instance a town or a city, I'm in shutter speed priority. So now all I need to do is on the dial of my camera is simply give consideration to the shutter speed in the shot. Shutter speed controls movement. So therefore, if I set my camera to, let's say, an average shutter speed of 125th of a second, if you think of that as a as a smiley setting, as a setting that you would just capture people walking and talking and just going about their business, like a selfie setting, 125th of a second. But now instantly, if you see a skateboarder coming down the path, for instance, I now have at my disposal the ability in a split second to either slow my shutter speed down, and therefore I can pan with the skateboarder and attempt to blur the background out and keep the skateboarder looking very sharp in the image. I have the ability to do that, or of course on the other hand I can just increase my shutter speed to, let's say, 1,000th of a second, and then just freeze the skateboarder in the frame. And I use that quite a lot, and I do play around with that. Once you nail a shot or two, then I generally go outside of my comfort zone. I then, instead of shooting, say for instance, a moving cyclist at a 40th of a second, I then go down to maybe a 20th of a second or a 10th of a second and just play around and see if I can really nail that shot. But there's lots of factors to take into consideration: how fast they're moving, how close they are to you, and so on and so forth. But don't get too et up with it. But my advice to you would be either try shutter speed priority or aperture priority. Now, we've already discussed shutter speed priority, so let me very quickly discuss about aperture priority. We mentioned earlier about shooting with a 50mm prime lens. If you have a nifty 50, then that nifty 50 will shoot at 1.8, which is quite a wide aperture. So when you photograph people, then as long as they're fairly close to the camera, that will offer you quite a shallow depth of field. Therefore, it'll make the subject that you focus on really stand out in that frame. But you know, there's lenses out there that's capable of 1.4, 1.2, and of course wider apertures again. So that's something else to give consideration to as well. But don't just get single-minded about the whole thing. Don't just naturally assume what I should be doing then is actually shooting wide open all the time, and what I should be doing is shooting with a fast shutter speed all the time. Play around and be creative. Couple of tips I'll give is, one tip I would, it's difficult to get your head around this sometimes, but always try and photograph a scene with a person in it, and don't photograph a person in a scene. In other words, get your composition. Let's look at, say for instance, graffiti on a wall, which is a classic thing to shoot when you're shooting street photography. You might see, let's say for instance, a sexy lady on a wall, and then try and match it up then with somebody that walks into the frame, whether it's somebody completely opposite, so negatives and positives really work, or whether it's another sexy person and that's two positives and that also works. But try and set your scene up and then photograph somebody as they walk into it, as opposed to just picking up your camera and photographing somebody as they're walking down the street, because that doesn't necessarily work. It doesn't work very well at all, that. Another good tip I'll give you as well is to shoot for black and white. Black and white works really well for street photography. If you look back at some of the classical street photography pictures going back over the many years of photography, then you'll see most of them are black and white. Now obviously I know that's because a lot of them were taken, you know, before colour, but black and white seems to be quite an ageless form of taking photographs, and that's why we still do it now. My day-to-day work in life, we shoot an awful lot of black and white weddings, we shoot an awful lot of black and white portraits, without stating the obvious. People love it when you take pictures in black and white. And of course, there is a massive difference between just taking a picture and turning it into black and white, or shooting for black and white. But I'll make a video on that over the next few weeks and I'll explain that a bit better. But yeah, shoot for black and white. So let me explain what I mean. If you've got 4 football supporters stood, you know, maybe having a pint of beer or something, one wearing a red top, green, blue and yellow top, then of course they look as if they're odd in the frame, or they might dominate the frame because the colours are so strong. The minute you convert your picture to black and white, then of course these different colour shirts that they're wearing will just translate to different shades of grey, and now all of a sudden it looks as if not only are the guys meant to be there in the frame, but they'll also complement probably the background, which will also be in black and white without stating the obvious. So that works really well for me. Black and white, black and white, black and white.
I've never really been the one who's worried, always been the one who's keeping it cool, the kind of guy who chill while others hurry. I didn't know that I've been the fool. I've been telling lies about something real, but I know love is based on honesty. Kept thinking how real love should feel, knowing that it's not just you, it's me, 'cause I was made to be free. I am made to be free. I am made to be free. Well, I am made to be free.
Well, that's quite a difficult one to explain. It's about mood, it's about emotion, It's about just capturing, I suppose, people or things happening in a very natural way. Realistically, it's a bit like documentary photography. You're just documenting what's going on an ordinary day for certain people. Look for interesting subjects though. Look for, very difficult to say odd people, because it's all subjective what odd people actually means. We're odd to some people, I'm odd to a lot of people. But you know what I mean? Not all of us walk around the street with bright pink spiky hair with piercings all over their face and all over their body and tattoos. So look for interesting subjects. Again, I've no problem with that. They're very interesting subjects. Even people that might look really miserable, homeless people, obviously be respectful to them, of course. More often than not, they'll actually pose for you, they'll light a cigarette up for you. Sometimes you might have to buy them a cigarette, of course, but yeah, but they make great subjects. Where possible, avoid people in the center of a frame, just like you would do when shooting normally. Think composition, think rules of thirds, think lead-in lines. It's just standard practice, but of course when you're on the street you've got to think fast, you've got to think on the fly, and you know, you won't always get it right. That's the key, you won't always get it right. What makes for a very good picture as well in terms of a subject matter, I've mentioned it earlier, but think about opposites. Opposites work really, really well. I mentioned earlier about if you've got a beautiful picture of a sexy girl on the wall, then all of a sudden if somebody walks by that's a complete opposite, then that will work really well. Black and white works really well without stating the obvious. Happy and sad works. You know what I mean. Think contrasty. Tip that I will give you is to try and look inconspicuous sometimes, but not suspicious, and that's a massive difference. More often than not, I'm not going to hide myself. I'm 6'4", so more often than not, I'm happy to stand there with a camera proud in my hand, so people can clearly see what my intention is, and not just shooting under the arm or shooting through the legs or pretending to shoot when you don't shoot. Because if somebody catches you doing that, then you're likely to have a bit of confrontation, and that's never good for anybody. So my advice is, and even sometimes, you know, when people are walking past, you don't really want to smile at them to try and get them to smile back, because that's not natural. That's not what street photography is all about. But sometimes there are some greats in the past that will actually say, oi, oi, like that, and make someone look, and all of a sudden it's that, who's speaking to me like that? And it's that look on their face. Now, you've got to be a bit of a brave person to do that, but there are street photographers that actually work like that, and they work really well. You must admit, that's pretty cool. This is the serious bit, and this is the bit we get asked about over and over again. What is the law? Where do we stand legally wise, standing in the street taking pictures? Well, it's very simple actually, it's very black and white. Is the law in this country states that if you're on public land, then you're entitled to photograph anything you want. There are a couple of exceptions to that without stating the obvious, the MOD, and I wouldn't recommend standing taking photographs of police stations and so on and so forth, but legally you can, obviously not the MOD, and that's the only really exception to that rule. But of course, it's 2018. More often than not, you standing in the street, you know, wielding a camera around will generally make people feel a little bit suspicious of you, and that's really annoying. That is very, very, very annoying. It's almost like labeling all photographers as bad people. So know your rights, and your rights are, like I said earlier, if you're on public land, you're entitled to photograph anything you wish, with the odd exception. If you do find yourself in a position where you're being confronted by somebody whose picture you've just taken, the most important thing is just be very courteous and smile and show them the picture on the back of the camera, and you know, offer to email it to them, or if you feel that they're still being quite agitated by your actions, then offer to delete the picture. It's no big deal. You can grab that picture again. It really is no worries. Well, that's an easy one for me to answer, because it's a genre of photography that I absolutely love. And the reason why I love it is because I suppose there are no rules really, or there are too many rules to worry about. In other words, you could be rough around the edges with street photography. You can take pictures that are slightly slanted. The horizon doesn't have to be level. I mean, the quality of the image doesn't have to be perfect. You can see that in some of the images that I've taken. More often than not, you sit back at your desk, you look at them. When it comes to post-production, it's a case of, oh, if only I stood here, if only I stood there. But that's not what street photography is. Street photography is about now. It's about spontaneity. If you haven't got the correct settings in your camera, hey ho, sometimes it adds to it, sometimes it doesn't add to it. But that's the beauty of street photography.